Today, I am confirming that Nunavut's first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Pond Inlet.
Tonight, news out of Nunavut on the territory's first COVID case.
Our band puts up probably about $800,000 to this event, and people get a chance to make money with their treaty stands.
And how COVID-19 is affecting upcoming summer events and traditional ceremonies. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. Today, Nunavut confirmed their first positive test for the COVID-19 virus in the high Arctic community of Pond Inlet. Our Kent Driscoll has the latest.
Nunavut Premier Joe Savikata was on hand to break the news. Nunavut is no longer the only part of Canada without a positive test for COVID-19.
Today, I am confirming that Nunavut's first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Pond Inlet.
Pond Inlet, Mitimitalik in Inuktitut, is located on the northeast tip of Baffin Island, home to 1,600 people. It's a fly-in community, like every Nunavut community. It also faces the challenges of overcrowded housing that all Nunavut communities face, and those conditions are ideal for COVID-19 to spread.
This travel ban is a necessary containment measure to minimize the risk of COVID-19 spreading to multiple communities at once.
The government told residents which community the virus was in order to prevent a run on all 25 Nunavut health centers. After that, the details are scarce. The person is in isolation in Pond Inlet. 20 people the patient may have been in contact with are being immediately tested for COVID-19. The patient is doing well.
The individual developed symptoms last week, was swabbed on the 23rd and has been, to our best information, isolating at home since then. The results came back positive yesterday. Staff in Pond Inlet started contact tracing already and have identified close to 20 people who have been swabbed overnight, and those swabs will be analyzed here in Iqaluit probably later today.
So for most of Nunavut, nothing has changed and everything has changed. All the restrictions put in before the positive test remain in place, while Pond Inlet gets some stricter measures. But the virus is here, in Nunavut, and the territory's preparations are going to be put to the test. Kent Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
To Ottawa now, where the Prime Minister tipped his hat to the Canadian Armed Forces for their help during the pandemic and in the wake of yesterday's tragic helicopter crash off the coast of Greece. And Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller gave an update on how Indigenous communities are handling the pandemic. Jamie Pashigumskum reports.
The Prime Minister gave his condolences to the families and friends of Abigail Calbro. She's one of the 6 Canadian soldiers lost in the crash of an armed forces helicopter during NATO exercises off the coast of Greece yesterday. Closer to home, members of the armed forces have been deployed to assist in seniors' care facilities in Quebec and Ontario.
The women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces are the hand of our intentions, the concrete expression of our valor and values as Canadians.
Chief Medical Officer Dr. Teresa Tam said that Canadians are flattening the curve, but there is still cause for concern, especially in Indigenous communities.
I am also concerned about increasing numbers of COVID-19 in First Nations communities in several provinces. We must get ahead of things to protect and support these communities, ramping up testing and contact tracing to find where chains of transmission are occurring.
Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller said remote communities have taken strict measures, and his department is happy with the results.
To date, over $690 million in funding has been directly allocated by Indigenous Services towards the health response to COVID-19. This includes activities undertaken directly by the department, such as procurement of supplies and nursing services, as well as the preparedness measures being undertaken by communities.
Miller claimed his department responds to community requests for equipment and support within 24 hours, and communities are coping with the pandemic. Jamie Pashigumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Still in Ontario, where the Premier remains adamant he cannot set a clear date for the province to begin lifting stay-at-home restrictions. There are growing calls for certain areas of the province that have been unaffected to be allowed to reopen earlier than others. Doug Ford says that won't be happening.
The problem is there is no border around Toronto, around the GTA, and sure enough, if you open up in a rural area, a lot of people are just going to head up there and go into these rural areas. We have to do it as a province all together. We do see some good results, some positive results in the public domain. I want companies to start getting ready.
Ford says his government will continue to update guidelines set out for Ontario businesses as they plan for the eventual reopening of the province. To Alberta now, the Fort McKay First Nation north of Fort McMurray has reported the death of a community member because of the flood occurring on the Athabasca River. In a release, RCMP said officers responded to a request to help two men stranded on the river. The pair were on ATVs on a trail when water levels surged and they ended up in the water. Both were taken to hospital. One has died. The ice jam flooding has forced over 13,000 people from their homes this week, but the ice is melting and water levels are now receding. Still to come, we'll speak with lawyer Pam Pomodoro about the verdict in a hit-and-run case in New Brunswick. Stay with us.
Lamarand, and here's who we'll be speaking to on Nation to Nation. The Nom-Geez Nation in British Columbia is dealing with an outbreak of COVID-19, where there have been dozens of cases and one death. We talked to a frontline worker there about how well the response has been. As well, we have our weekly briefing with Indigenous Services. Is there enough data to know if they're flattening the curve on First Nations? And should communities that have launched lockdowns reopen at the same time provinces do? That's coming up right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 12 in St. John's, 13 with showers for Halifax, 5 and rain in Nain, 8 and showers for Happy Valley Goose Bay, rain and 13 for Montreal, showers and 4 in Saguenay, showers and 16 for Toronto and London, rain and 15 in Ottawa, 19 with showers in Thunder Bay, 17 and sunny skies in Sioux Lookout. +2 with snow for Thompson, -1 and snow in Churchill, 19 and showers for Winnipeg, 21 and rain for Dauphin, 19 with showers for Regina, sun's out in North Battleford with a high of 18, showers and 15 in Meadow Lake, snow and +2 in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. On Monday, a judge in New Brunswick found Maurice Johnson not guilty in the 2018 hit-and-run death of 22-year-old Mi'kmaq youth Brady Francis. Johnson always maintained that he thought he struck a deer. Many are comparing the injustice to the high-profile cases of Colton Bushy and Tina Fontaine. Pam Pomodoro, a Mi'kmaq lawyer, joins us now from her home in Toronto. Pam, thanks for joining us. What was your reaction when you heard the news of Monday's verdict?
Well, I felt once again really disappointed, but not surprised. I mean, case after case after case, you see scenarios where, you know, there's non-guilty verdicts against people who are alleged to have murdered or otherwise caused the, you know, violence or death against Indigenous peoples. And then when it comes around to investigations, you see police officers from police forces all across the country who aren't doing their job to investigate crimes. And it just seems to be an ongoing pattern, even in 2020.
Some have compared the death of Brady Francis to the Tina Fontaine and Colton Bushy cases. Why do you think the sense of injustice is so strongly felt with these three cases?
I think it's because everyone expected this verdict. I mean, that it's gotten to the stage in Canada, and I mean, we're talking literally about thousands of cases over many decades, where we can predict with a great deal of certainty that there most likely won't be justice in these cases. I mean, first of all, we're not using any Indigenous laws, we're not using any Indigenous court systems or any other kind of conflict resolution systems. It's not Indigenous peoples who are sitting as judges and prosecutors and juries. It's like Indigenous peoples are almost always excluded from the decision-making part of the justice system and are almost always the victims of the justice system. And, you know, it's not like we don't know this. We've had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Donald Marshall Inquiry, the Upper Inquiry, the Manitoba Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, I mean, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing. We know there's racism in the justice system, but it still isn't being addressed.
Pam, I guess some of the things that you just mentioned there, are those the types of reforms to the Canadian legal system that can make a difference for victims and families in cases like this?
Oh, I think so. Right now, we have absolutely no say and no control over any of these processes. Our laws aren't being used. Our systems aren't being used. We're not decision makers. We're unfairly excluded, even from, you know, the Canadian processes. And I think the more we, you know, assert and defend and enforce our own laws over our own territories with our own, you know, justice systems, like they do in the tribal governments in the U.S., the better that we're going to be. At the same time, we also need massive reforms in Canada's justice system. I mean, they have no problem over-incarcerating us at incredibly alarming rates. But when it comes to actually getting justice for victims, it seems to be very few and far between.
Pam, just to switch gears, you know, you've got your YouTube channel and the Your Warrior Life podcast. Today you launched a new podcast for children called Warrior Kids. Can you tell us about the project and how you plan to address issues of injustice with young listeners?
Well, I mean, I'm really, really excited about this because the YouTube channel and the Warrior Life podcast, you know, primarily targeted at adults, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but I was getting so many kids who come up to me at schools or speaking events saying, I listened to your podcast, I wish you had one for kids, I would like to understand this. And teachers all over the country saying, we need more resources to have Indigenous voices teaching about Indigenous issues. And the thing about my podcast, you know, that I'm really trying to promote is that this is education for action. This isn't education for entertainment purposes. This is about teaching Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids how to be social justice warriors and earth justice warriors to have a future for all of us, which will be celebrating everything that's Indigenous, but it's also going to be teaching some of the difficulties that we've had, residential schools and racism and the poverty that we deal with because of the injustice and lack of treaty rights. And I think it's important that kids know that, because ultimately they're going to be the policymakers and lawmakers and decision makers, and we want them to come from a really good grounding.
Well, I'm sure it will be wildly successful. Pam, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate your time here today.
Thanks for having me.
In Northern Ontario, Senator Lynn Bayak's hometown city council says it will not be calling for her resignation. In a virtual council meeting Wednesday night, Dryden City Council voted 5-2 against censuring the suspended senator's conduct. Bayak was first suspended from the Senate for refusing to remove racist letters from her website. Then a second time for not taking her first suspension seriously. Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler says Dryden City Council is also not taking the matter seriously. In a Facebook post, Fiddler wrote, I would encourage event organizers like tournaments to avoid Dryden as a host city in the future, because if they condone racism, it's not a safe place for our children. Powaghan Macbeth is an Indigenous adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth. The play was supposed to resume touring this spring, but with COVID-19, that tour has been postponed. That hasn't stopped the play's creators from making a condensed version live on the web. Chris Stewart has that story.
APTN National News has shown you about Powaghan Macbeth earlier this year. It's a reimagining of Macbeth, but from an 1800s Cree perspective. Renalta Arluk wrote the story, on how greed and lust for power has unintended consequences. COVID-19 halted 2 Edmonton performances and a 2-week tour of the Northwest Territories this spring. But Arluk says she was approached by the National Arts Centre's Canada Performs to perform. They have a $700,000 fund to pay artists to perform on the web while COVID-19 is ongoing.
And so then we brought the forward question to the actors and asked, like, would you be interested in doing Pawagin Macbeth, Canada Performs version? And, you know, everyone agreed wholeheartedly. So then we all put our heads together to figure out how to do that.
Aaron Wells plays the lead. He says it was a challenge moving from stage to performing in front of a stationary camera for the internet.
My frame, as you see, is only about this big. I don't have this this big stage that I need to fill and sort of get my story across that way. So it's going to be an interesting sort of balance to figure out, you know, what do I need to do, what do I and what don't I need to do that will still carry the story.
Like their live performances, they will interact with the audience after the show.
We're going to share some of the play itself with a Zoom perspective, and then we're going to open up and just kind of talk about our experiences in the community.
I think it's a great way to broadcast this beautiful story that comes from Cree cosmology and teachings to give a sliver of exactly what that is, and then hopefully entice people to actually come and see it when it comes out on its different platforms.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Should be interesting. Nice to see people trying new ideas. As you saw, concerts, sporting events, festivals all being canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But what will be the impact to First Nations traditional ceremonies? Details after the break. Here's a look at the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Rain and 11 for Fort McMurray, 15 in Grand Prairie. Showers and 18 for Medicine Hat and Lethbridge. Rain and 14 in Vancouver and Victoria, 19 and sunny in Kamloops. Sunny and 15 for Fort Nelson and Smithers. +3 in Old Crow under sunny skies, 9 above for Whitehorse. 16 with showers in Fort Liard and Trout Lake, +2 for Yellowknife. -11 in Saxe Harbor, 7 below for Pawlatuck. -15 in Repulse Bay, 9 below for Arviette. -15 in Arctic Bay and Igloolik. Welcome back. With Summerfest approaching, traditional First Nations ceremonies and community events were set to take place over the coming months. But COVID-19 has postponed or canceled many of them. Daryl Stranger tells us the impact this will have on communities and people who rely on them.
You probably won't be seeing ceremonies like this taking place anytime soon over the summer. COVID-19 continues to push back events around the world, and it's no different in First Nation communities. Peguis, Manitoba's largest First Nation, has already canceled high school graduations, but this summer will bring even more cancellations, including Treaty Days.
Treaty Days is looking ever bleak. Everybody, elders to youth, look forward to this event, and as far as the economic impact, just alone, our band puts up probably about $800,000 to this event, and people get a chance to make money with their treaty stands and the various activities that go on throughout the week, or 10 days, I guess it is, and beginning in mid-July.
Sweat lodges are also affected by the pandemic, with some being completely shut down. Others will try open with social distancing measures. One of those reopening with restrictions is run by the Southeast Resource Development Council Corporation, which is made up of 8 First Nations in Southeast Manitoba. The mental wellness facilitator says having sweat lodges open is just as important now than it has ever been.
Now, people are going to sweat lodge to help deal with day-to-day stresses, So it's still quite important, even though the purpose of it, the use of it has changed. It is still very important for a lot of people. At our sweat lodge, there are a number of people who are very regular attendees, and there are some who come periodically only when they feel a need to attend.
Young also added that sun dances, the most sacred ceremonies, will more than likely be postponed due to the size and community togetherness the ceremonies bring. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Certainly going to be a quiet summer. It's been more than 6 weeks since school was dismissed in Fisher River Cree Nation in Manitoba. And even though class is not back in session, the community came up with a plan to bring everyone together. On Wednesday afternoon, staff from the community's schools, daycare center, and child development programs got together to put on a drive-by parade. Approximately 60 vehicles drove through the community for 3 hours. Some staff dressed up in superhero costumes, while vehicles donned signs expressing encouragement and well wishes. Residents enjoyed the parade from the safety of their homes, and it's just what staff and students needed, according to the community's Director of Education.
There was a wide range of emotions. There was joy, there was laughter, there was even tears from the joy that not only with the children, but from our staff seeing the children for the first time in a while. So it was really a really emotional day. It was a day I think that is going to be remembered for a while now. And maybe something that may trigger an ongoing activity that we may have to have should this pandemic closure continue for any amount of time.
We could all just do that all summer long. APTN reporter and producer Kenneth Jackson is being recognized for his diligent work covering the child welfare system in Ontario. Jackson is this year's winner of the annual Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom Award. The award recognizes those who produce public interest journalism while overcoming secrecy or other efforts to prevent reporting. For several years, Jackson has worked to uncover the flawed child welfare system, beginning with the deaths of Kanina Sue Turtle and Amy Owen in northwestern Ontario. The two girls died by suicide while in provincial care. 2 years after first reporting on these deaths, Jackson uncovered 102 Indigenous youth who died while in care since 2013. He was featured in APTN Investigate's latest documentary, Left to Die. Here's an excerpt from that item.
To lay the truth bare, and that's always been my goal. At times, I look at it and I go, I'm faced with a massive amount of pushback or, laws and darkness almost. I'm trying to pull that truth out of the dark and into the light, so to speak, but they've worked really hard. It's designed to keep it in the dark.
And a huge congrats to Ken. It's well-deserved recognition for his important work. And that is your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Stick around. Todd Lamoran's up next with Nation to Nation. Have a great night.